Hello, everybody. Welcome to another Sales Hacker webinar. This one's going to be a fun one. We have two people who know all about sales compensation and sales planning. Cumulatively, it's kind of a tongue twister. They have, I think, decades of experience, not to age either one of you, but decades of experience in sales comp planning, which is pretty incredible. So I'm very excited for this. Obviously, you guys know what you signed up for, but today's webinar is going to be all about a compensation cookbook. So we're actually going to walk through each section of, say, a sales compensation plan and cover tips and tricks and strategies on how to do it correctly and also avoid what's not working right now when you're planning comp for your team, for your reps. Before we get into that, and in fact, before we even get into intros, just a couple of housekeeping items. This is recorded. Every webinar we get questions, is this going to be recorded? We usually get like 3, 4, 5 of them. I promise you will get the recording. I know we're all working from home. I got a dog sitting right next to me. She loves to bark. If you got to take the dog out, if you got a meeting you got to jump onto, you got to leave for whatever reason, about 24 hours after the webinar, you're going to get the recording. Number 2, we have some content lined up. I think it's really good content, but ultimately we're doing this for you, the people who show up live. So we want to cater this discussion around the problems that you guys are facing right now. And in order to do that, I'd like a little more context into what, why you joined. Why are you here today? So I'm going to launch a poll right now. And as people are trickling in, we had about like 500 people show up. So I see people, we have about 73 live right now with us. It's kind of like popcorn. We get, here's another one. There's another one. As you guys are joining, I just launched a poll. What's your role? And then secondly, what do you want to learn more about as it relates to sales compensation and sales planning? Interesting. So nobody can see this right now except for Rosalind, Christian, and myself. But I'm kind of surprised at the breakdown of demographics here. It's way different than most sales hacker webinars. I'm going to end this in 3, 2, and 1. So usually we get a whole bunch of individual contributors. We get a bunch of BDRs, SDRs, and we have 37% of the room right now is sales leadership, sales executives. It makes a lot of sense. You guys are responsible for creating these plans. And also a lot of sales ops folks, which also makes a lot of sense. Of course, we have a smattering of individual contributors, maybe looking to just level up their knowledge. Then what do you want to learn more about? It looks like a general overview of what to include in the sales comp plan is the winner here, 71% of the room. And then also setting quota targets and determining on-target earnings. You're in luck. We're going to cover all of this and more. And I'm going to introduce the people who are going to help us do that. Kicking it off with Rosalyn Santa Elena. Rosalyn, welcome to the community.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Would you mind giving the crew with us here today just kind of your superhero origin story? How'd you get into sales? How'd you get to be at such a cool company?
Yeah, so I don't know if it's a super cool story or a superhero story, but I'm Rosalind. I'm currently the head of revenue operations at Clari. I've been, really leading go-to-market operations for about 20 years now, both large enterprise companies as well as smaller high-growth startups. I love being in operations. I sort of landed in ops, really starting with sales compensation. So sales comp has really a special place in my heart. I've almost always owned kind of the process end to end, from design through payroll. So I'm super excited, obviously, to be a part of this discussion today, but really started in sales comp. So it's an interesting place and then sort of expanded into other areas of operations.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Also joining us is Christian Borrelli. He leads sales at CaptivateIQ. Christian, same question to you. Give us your superhero origin story.
Yeah, well, first, thanks for having me. Happy to be here. I guess I don't think many superheroes started their career in finance, but that's kind of where I got my start. I had been had a stint in sales before that, then got into finance and eventually sales ops roles. Some roles similar to Rosalind. Had a lot of exposure to supporting sales orgs, but also in doing that, writing a lot of comp plans, handling commissions, ensuring that we were incentivizing the right things. And then that's kind of where stars aligned for me when I met a couple of founders in Y Combinator that were starting a new company to go after the sales commission space. And that was here at CaptivateIQ. So joined here to build out the sales function almost 2.5 years ago now.
Interesting. So you joined early. You joined the founders in some very early stage company formulation.
Back when it was a couple of people in the back room of a friend's startup. And now we're almost 60 folks strong and have raised our Series A and everything from Sequoia this year, which was super exciting. But yeah, it's been a lot of growth, all very exciting, all very quickly.
That's awesome. Thank you both for joining us. Like I said, two perfect people to talk about sales compensation planning. To kick off the conversation, let's kind of address the elephant in the room, which is 2020. 2020 has not been a kind year, and sales comp is not excluded from that, right? There's been a lot of discussions around, do we adjust our quota up or down to kind of help alleviate some of the pain that our sellers are feeling when they go to market. I'd love to get both of your thoughts on what you're seeing in the market, maybe what you're seeing at your individual companies as it relates to 2020 and planning into 2021. Have you had to adjust how you design and plan sales comp at all? And if so, how? I'll kick it off to Rosalind first.
Yeah, so definitely. So that's obviously a great question. Definitely the elephant in the room. I think most of us, now that we're sort of approaching, hopefully, the tail end of 2020 and everything that's been happening, knock on wood. But I think at the beginning of the year, I think most companies went out with, their kickoff, all their growth plans, here, the hurrah, hurrah, kind of what we're going to be doing for this year. And then the pandemic hit. Right. And so everyone had to quickly reevaluate their operating plan, look at their go-to-market strategy, look at their target personas, really do a complete evaluation, almost a replanning cycle of, how they're going to target the year. And so most companies, or most folks that I've talked to, have, obviously adjusted their plans, potentially had to relaunch quotas, even make tweaks to their comp plan, right? Because a lot of companies have shifted the focus, knowing that they're probably not going to acquire as many net new logos in this year as companies are tightening their budgets or even closing out their budgets. And so really shifting more to your customer, your existing customer base, and looking at, expansion within your existing customers, as well as retention. I think there's a big focus in those areas. I guess going along those same lines for 21 planning, similarly, right, is focusing on not only how are you going to acquire net new customers, but also how you're going to continue to help your existing customers be successful.
It's a theme that we've been hearing a lot lately. This focus on your existing base, trying to reduce churn, trying to make your existing customer base happy, fulfilled, find value from your product. Christian, would you add anything there? Are you seeing anything in the market? How are you dealing with this?
So I think there's a pretty broad spectrum, at least from what we've seen. And on the two extremes, there's some companies that are in industries that have been just hit very, very hard, where they've had to really make large changes in their organization. Some have even suspended commission plans and really put the folks that they are keeping on board on some kind of fixed draw, just because they need predictability in the business. That's fairly rare, but again, I've seen that in certain industries. On the other end of the spectrum, there's obviously certain products and spaces that are doing incredibly well in this environment. So on that end, we've seen companies that actually really ramped up hiring and replanned to raise quotas because they were just seeing a flood of traffic and pipeline that they hadn't seen before. Most companies generally falling in kind of somewhere between those, though. And I think from what we've seen, a lot of companies are kind of sharing the burden with their sales team if they are making adjustments to their plans, maybe because they have cash concerns. They're only going to start releasing commissions based on cash actually being paid in by the customers that are being signed. They're also making a quota adjustment, knowing that they can't have the same expectation for reps to be delivering 5, 6, 7x of quota in new business, just given the environment that we found ourselves in back in Q2. I think to Rosalind's point, one of the other things coming out of it is in 2021 planning. Companies, especially those that learned maybe a hard lesson this year because they were growing at a really aggressive rate, They're being a little more realistic and conservative with how they're thinking about next year. From planning, hiring, the quota assignment, the typical annual quota increase that maybe they had been planning. Now they're taking a more conservative, realistic look at that plan and thinking, okay, instead of just coming up with a big number, doing some division and figuring out how many heads we need to hire, they're thinking more about what's feasible, how much pipeline can we be generating, what can we convert that at, and then what does the team look like that can be fed by that pipeline. I think that's, from my standpoint, a healthy place, especially for companies in the Bay Area to be operating in, just because it's taking a step back from that growth at all cost mindset, crazy comp plans that are maybe incentivizing some outside the box behavior rather than focusing on good, sustainable, healthy growth.
Almost like a reset of expectations. You're having to realign your expectations to deal with all this, frankly, shit that everyone is having to deal with right now, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of, and I think at least with from what we've seen and feedback we hear from communities like Sales Hacker is, reps are appreciating that companies are being supportive and rethinking those plans, and that their team of 5 AEs today isn't suddenly going to be 25 AEs next year just because there's a really crazy target that they want to hit.
Love that. Thank you. I say we dive into it. People join because they wanted to get a pretty good overview, it sounds like, of what's included in a good comp plan and maybe some things not to include, things not to do. So let's start there. When you're designing a comp plan, what elements have you seen or do you always include? I'll kick it off to Rosalind first.
So I think I always tell people when you're designing a comp plan, that's KISS methodology works, right? Keep it stupid simple, right? You've got to keep it simple. If your sales rep doesn't understand how they get paid, then your plan is, it's useless. It's just not going to be effective. So starting with that in mind, always keeping it simple, is I always start with high level objectives. Like what do we want to do? What are we trying to achieve for the year, right? And start with your go-to-market strategy and sort of your key objectives. And that's not a laundry list of 10 things or 12 things, right? It's boil it down to the simple things. Is it growth? Is it retention, right? Is it conversion? Sort of those high level points. And you start with those objectives. And that's how I always start at that very highest level and then design from there, right? Because then you can start looking at the roles and the responsibilities and what are the accountabilities and the things that we want to drive by role, and then start to break that down.
So you got your key, let's say, call them quarterly objectives. It could be revenue. It could be keeping your existing, churn,
yes.
Big company objectives. Moving on from there, you mentioned roles, like establishing roles.
Yeah. So I think about, you have different components of your revenue team, depending how large they are, right? You might have your account executives. You might have like a, more of a hunter farmer model. You may have more of just a general account management type of model. But you think about, your traditional, AE, for example, or your SDR, and then your account management, maybe your renewals team, right? And think about in terms of your business and those type of roles, and what are sort of the key things that you want that role to go after for the year, right? What does success look like? And that's how I sort of boil it down, because you have your go-to-market objectives, then you break it down into within those roles, who's going to be driving those. And then that way you can start to build out what comp structure is going to, best incent that behavior.
Right. So you got your, traditional tech company will have, sales organization will have business development, let's say entry-level BDR, like mid-level BDR, senior BDR. Same thing for account executives. You probably have a CSM team as well.
Yep.
Just to give like a feel of what we're talking about. This is from Sales Hacker. This is essentially it, right? Where you're building out, you have your key high-level objectives. You have, your quarterly growth targets. And then from there, you come up with these like target to attain targets. And they can create these different roles from there with their base variable on target. Love it. What else? Let's move on. So we have our key quarterly objectives. We have our different roles broken out. What was that?
Oh, I think you froze for a second. I don't know if it's on my end or yours, but we're good.
It's this super stable Alaskan internet. Let's talk about on-target earnings. Is there a standard like formula that you guys use to come up with on-target earnings? Are there multiple different ways to come up with OTE? How do you guys set on-target earnings for each one of those
Yep, I think we
goals?
lost you, but I don't know, Christian, do you want to take this one first, or do you want me to dive in?
Yeah, I mean, I think I know Alex had shared some maybe benchmarks there from Sales Hacker. The way I look at it and what we tend to see is be really ubiquitous, at least for closing roles, is always a 50-50 split. And to me, I think a 50-50 split for quota carrying closing role or closing manager role makes the most sense. You want reps that are hunters, want a plan and OTE structure that's as leveraged as possible. I'm always a little bit dubious of having a higher base and sacrificing variable for that, because then it really brings down the ceiling in terms of upside there. I think beyond that, with other roles where maybe it's an SE role or another kind of sales support role where they're contributing to sales, they have an impact, they're working closely with the closers, but don't necessarily control everything within the process. It makes sense for them to be on less leveraged plans, closer to anywhere from a 60-40 to an 80-20 split. And then for other, depending on how companies break up their CSM, AM org, where CSMs are really more focused on true customer success rather than being farmers. I think that's also a less leveraged role, because it's, you don't want it, you deliberately, in the spirit of customer success, don't want it to be really heavily driven by closing, growing. It's much more about delivering a holistic, solid customer success experience. So that might be more like an 80-20 plan, maybe 70-30 plan, where it's on a quarterly bonus based on some high-level retention rates. I think it does vary by geo as well. Like in the Bay Area, BDRs will just have a different type of mix, because there's market rates and what a realistic base salary is. And San Francisco is just very different from Arizona, Detroit, something like that, where that mix can be shook up if a BDR wants a more leveraged plan.
Yeah, and I would just add, I mean, maybe even a step back from sort of the splits around OTE and just sort of how we generally, or how I've generally seen practice around setting OTE by role, has really been a lot of market benchmarking against other companies, similar companies we used to use. When I was at larger companies, we used Radford, for example, as a salary survey, but really benchmarking against like companies, kind of like for like companies, and looking for the type of talent that we would be trying to basically motivate to join our company, right, in order to bring them on board. And then start looking at sort of, so that's kind of OTE, and to Christian's point, geography does come into play. From my perspective, I've typically tried to keep if you're within the same country like US, even if you, especially now that we're kind of moving into this remote world where everybody is working from anywhere, trying to keep that consistent. So even if you have an AE and you're expecting them to bring in X amount of dollars in, say, net new business, I'm expecting that AE, wherever they sit, that they're going to be paid at the same type of OTE, regardless of sort of market. I know that's a big debate amongst different people, like,
it's a hot topic these days.
Yeah,
Rosalind.
I think it's definitely a hot topic. But I really look at sort of roles and responsibilities and expectations, right? Because it is harder to acquire talent previously in high tech areas. But at the same time, now that everyone's sort of working from anywhere, Hawaii, Alaska, California, wherever we all are, I think making sure that we have sort of that level playing field for paying for performance is important. But I do think that outside of the country, when you look at globally, places like in Asia, tend to be less leveraged, right? They tend to have a higher base and less variable, especially in countries like Japan. In Europe, sort of the same type of thing, but obviously in North America, we tend to have more highly leveraged plans, even seeing a 40-60 type of split, where there's more upside. But yeah, I agree generally, if you're a closing type of role, 50-50 split makes a lot of sense.
I think another thing that I had to give any advice to AEs that are listening in. Beyond, I think folks get really hung up on OTE. Companies, when they're setting their ranges for OTE, get really hung up on just the raw dollars there. Obviously, we're talking about comp plans. I think that's something that's incredibly important, and that folks should, in looking for new roles, should really spend a lot of time looking into, understanding what the current team is doing, how lucrative is that comp plan really, because there's a lot of cases where a rep on 120K OT can in actuality do much better than a rep on 180K OT because it's a more lucrative plan, because the kickers, accelerators are much more friendly to the rep. There's not capped commissions, there's not gates to accelerators. The variables aren't hacked up into a bunch of different quotas. And I think that's one thing that I've seen some of, where companies will have a high OT, but make it really much more difficult to get there because it's a much higher multiple. And like I said, the variable can be cut up and tied to a bunch of different quotas. So it's, while OT I think is a good, obviously an important metric to look at from both the planning standpoint for companies and for folks looking at new roles, I think everyone would do themselves a service just to double click more on the economics of the plans from a company side, but also what the upside looks like to the plans for folks that are looking at joining.
Really interesting, Christian. If I'm an account executive and I want to make sure I know what I'm getting myself into, how do I best find out that information? Is that something I would find out during the interview process? Is that something that I could maybe like find a mentor to help guide me through that process? What would you recommend if I'm an account executive and I'm actively looking for a new role?
Yeah, I think if you're an account executive, you're looking at a new role, you should definitely trust but verify or validate. Ask the hiring manager, what does the plan look like? How's the current team doing? Not just in terms of quota attainment, but how much they're, roughly bringing in against their OTE. You should ask to see what the plan looks like, even, see a calculator or examples of what you could be making, especially when the plan has kickers and bonuses above and beyond OTE, because that's where can really do quite well, not just getting above quota into accelerators, but most SaaS companies have kickers and bonuses around multi-year deals, paid upfront deals, stuff that is pretty typical in B2B SaaS beyond like the SMB segment. So I think that's where you'd really want to dig in, and then ask a friend, ask a mentor how that comp plan compares to what their plan looks like, and obviously look at it, how it compares to past plans you've been on, and your past performance.
Yeah, I would just add on top of kind of what Christian's saying. I mean, really looking at how are the reps performing, and what are the actuals, and sort of how do they model out their comp plan? Like, where do they expect sort of that bell curve to look? Like, where do their bulk of their reps fall? But I would also dig into sort of how the company is getting behind helping the sales rep make their numbers, right? What's the messaging? Where are they investing? Where are they investing, for example, in their go-to-market, right? In marketing and brand awareness and all the different sort of campaigns and initiatives that are happening in the year to help really help the sales rep be successful. Because I think there's a lot more than, obviously them coming in, they're a great closer and they know how to sell, but what about what's happening with the product, right? What's happening in the market? What are we doing, to address our competition and things like that? Getting a higher level view of the company as a whole and their entire go-to-market strategy, including maybe even like their product roadmap. Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. Love it. We just had a very good question come in from Brandon Mendoza. I'm going to field it to you two, if you don't mind. It's relevant to the conversation. It has to do with compensation against bookings, to accelerate deal flow versus cash collections, which could improve, deal quality, potentially, right? His exact question is, what have you seen for best practices for SaaS companies? Oh, did you lose him? I think I can read the question. So this is booked versus billed versus company cash flow /risk. I think we lost you just a little bit, Alex, there, but I think the question is around, whether it's bookings versus billings versus cash collections. My Alaskan internet is at it again. Would you mind repeating that question, Rosalind? Yeah, so it's a question around kind of bookings versus billings versus cash collections. Kind of what's kind of best practices in terms of paying a sales rep? Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So I'm sure Christian has some strong opinions about this, but I actually am not a fan of cash collections at all. I think once in my lifetime I've done that, and that was back in 2000 when the market crashed, right? And cash, that was the whole saying around cash is king. I believe I'm more of the philosophy around, again, aligning role responsibility with the goals, right? So if the goal or the primary achievement that we want a rep to go after, an AE, is to close net new business, then to me, their job is to obviously bring in a good deal, but it's also to get that deal closed and bring the paper in. And timing, timing commission payout with the action or the activity is really critical, right? For a sales compensation plan to be successful. You want to pay as close to the actual action as possible, in other words.
I would, I guess, wholeheartedly agree with that with one small caveat. I think there's very specific situations in which it makes sense to definitely still give credit based on bookings, but release the commission payout on cash receipt. And that's for, you can imagine, like restaurant tech, where seeing companies have issues where they don't end up collecting 5 to 10% of the what they're billing. And it can be a more transactional kind of full cycle sales rep motion. Where I think it makes sense from the business side, and it makes the most sense for those reps to be the folks chasing down payments that aren't getting made. Beyond that, though, fully agree with Rosalind. It never really makes sense to tie anything to cash. There could be a good argument for it from an internal cash management standpoint, but I'd always argue that you're going to have a net negative there because reps will just add friction to the process. If anything, you'll have reps acting like AR folks chasing down invoices, and that's not what you're paying a sales rep a couple $100,000 a year to be doing. You want them going and closing more business, right? So I think where there's, even in a year like this, where some companies had to move to it temporarily, by and large, it's just not a good long-term solution because, to Rosalind's other point, you're delaying the kind of satisfaction and positive reinforcement to the rep, adding friction in that process, and then distracting them from going and just closing more deals.
And I guess I would add to that, Christian, I think that's a great point, is unless you have a cash collection problem, shifting, you definitely don't want your sales reps to be the AR, the collector, and sort of be viewed as that person in a sales cycle. The other thing I would say is the timing piece, as you mentioned. I think that was a really good point around the fact that we're sort of in this potentially a temporary situation where we might be constructing deals that are a little bit more creative, where maybe there's a bit more payment delay, and sort of timing maybe those commission payments to some of that in the exceptional type of process when you have to do something extraordinary to close a deal. I think that makes sense. I think, Alex, you were talking about obviously having, giving the onus to the reps to make sure that they're accountable for creating good deals for the company. And I think that's really important too. I do think that can be probably addressed more on the deal, kind of the deal approval or a deals desk type of process, and sort of how you negotiate your contracts, and sort of do some of that more upstream versus downstream after a deal is closed.
Love that. That makes a lot of sense. We had another great question just come through from Anonymous. I'm also very curious about this. So how do you compensate, quote unquote, supporting sales roles? I think what they're getting at here is like, a sales engineer or sales enablement or sales ops. Is that plan leveraged at all? Is it just, do they have any variable pay? I'll kick it over to Christian first.
Yeah, I think, and I'm firmly in the camp that anybody on a sales team should be on some kind of leverage plan, some kind of variable plan. The thought there being everyone should be aligned towards whatever the goals are. Typically in a SaaS startup, it's ARR growth, right? I think the specific mechanics around it just vary based on your team makeup. I don't think there's a one size fits all there. If you have and when I was in enterprise security, there was a one-to-one mapping between AE and SE. So it made sense for those SEs to be tied to that AE's number and for them to succeed or not succeed together. It's more common though, where an SE will be mapped to a pod, a team, a region, where you then might just tie them to that team's number. The logic there being that you want them to be, whether they worked on a specific deal or not for one of the folks on that team, they're working with them. If they're good SE, they should be helping those AEs sell better, learn more, know their product better, know the motion better. So whether they had direct involvement in a deal or not, they're part of that team. They should be succeeding, or again, not succeeding, based on how that team is doing.
So just to recap, yes, some kind of variable pay, if I have it tied to more team objectives versus individual objectives.
Yeah, and I'm completely in that camp as well with Christian. I mean, even for an operations role, like my role should be tied to a revenue number as well. You know, I really look at operations and just for that alignment. I know that's another big debate around, should ops folks have, you know, more goal setting, and maybe it's a hybrid, right? I've seen both, right? I've seen where maybe the leader is tied to the CRO's number versus the team might be a combination of have a revenue component, but then sort of KPIs or MBOs that are tied to very project specific type of goals as well. And same thing with the SEs and other supporting roles. I think tying to a team or region, you know, kind of the group that they support, or the pod, as we like to call it. I actually don't like that word, but the pod, that group, you know, that makes complete sense to me. And that's what I've seen in the past as well.
Love it. Thank you. Jay Banks in the chat here with another question. We're getting flooded with questions. How can we commission AEs for critical activities versus close? Should we? Is that motivating? So something we see done pretty frequently with like BDRs, SDRs, compensating based on activities versus like close one revenue. Is that something you see done for account executives as well? Should it be done? What are your opinions, Rosalind?
So I haven't seen AE plans tied to specific milestones. I do think that through the management of, you know, deal management, opportunity management, you know, forecasting management, you see sort of that more of a management process, you know, kind of managed through process and policy versus through compensation. I think at the end of the day, if a sales rep is doing all the right things throughout the deal cycle, it will ultimately result in more conversion and more close one deals.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with that. Where I think it could make sense for an AE might be, you know, true enterprise AE that's coming on board and there's no expectation for them to close a deal in their first 12 to 18 months because that's just what sales cycles look like at that scale. Then I think having some kind of ramp, potentially draw or MBO driven payouts can make sense. Beyond that though, I think you solve for folks ramping up with ramped quotas or draws. And then it doesn't really make sense from that standpoint to compensate based on activities, because at the end of the day, they should be managed around those activities. If they have a good manager, they should be driving them to, you know, book the right meetings, get the right progress, do a certain type of proof of concept, whatever. But at the end of the day, you want them focused on getting to results, not necessarily gaming things around activities. I think that's where you could always kind of spiff things. But from a plan perspective, you want them just focused on getting to ultimately the results they need, whether that's ARR, ACV, TCV, whatever else.
Love it. Give me 1 second here. I'm getting bombarded with questions. Trying to find a good one. Here's an easy one. Do you typically pay from $1 sold or require minimum thresholds to be met? Rosalind, you look like you want to answer it.
I had this discussion recently with somebody. That's why I'm smiling. I'm not a big fan of minimum thresholds, but I'm also in the camp of I'm not a fan of caps. I'm actually, boy, maybe I should be a salesperson. I sound more like a salesperson than an ops person. But I mean, I think I've worked in the industry long enough and with sales and go-to-market teams long enough to know sort of what's motivating and what's not, right? And I think I like to pay first dollar, whether that's at a different rate that can be debated, but I think for closing a deal, you close a deal, you should get paid. And again, that kind of goes back to the conversation around timing payment with, the activity as closely as possible.
Yeah, I think it's commonly referred to as like a cliff, where there's a base rate of maybe 10%, but they actually make zero from 0 to 50% of their quota, and then they're making 20% for the second half. I think that's, say, unnecessarily punitive and demotivating to reps. Where you see that a lot is companies where they're taking the stance of kind of feed the eagles, starve the turkeys, which isn't a great saying, right? Like you can get from that they're looking to kind of pull one over on the reps. And I think sales is already hard enough. It's already hard enough to hire good sales reps. A good rep is going to be immediately put off from a plan like that. And I think the argument against it would be, well, if you're a good rep, you're going to overachieve, you're going to make money in accelerators, you don't have to worry about it. But I think as a company, if you're believing in your hiring motion and the people you're bringing on board, you shouldn't have some kind of cruel carrot to be dangling in front of them like a cliff there. Would also wholeheartedly agree with Rosalind again in terms of no caps. I don't think caps ever make sense. If anything at all, you'd bring it back down to a base rate. But capping commission plans is really just capping the potential for growth in the business that you can be doing, right? I think in the same vein there, it's demotivating and potentially even a worse way there, because you could have a rep doing so well that you're going to stop paying the money. Doesn't make any sense from an economics perspective or just a team culture perspective.
Let's double click into that, Christian. Before, on our pre-webinar, we talked about some of the common mistakes that organizations make when they're putting together a comp plan. I've heard a couple already, compensating on cash. What else? What are some other common mistakes that you see included in comp plans?
Yeah, I think we covered some of the big ones. Another one, it may sound a little odd, but there's a lot of cases where the comp plan can actually incentivize behavior that is basically incentivizing the reps to negotiate against the business. And to give an example of this, there's a time I saw a company spend quite a lot of time and money with consultants on their commission plans. And at the end of all of it, they had one piece in their plan that told the reps, we're going to severely dock your payout on any deals where your services component is below a certain percentage of the subscription ACV. So lo and behold, they found that in a lot of cases, they had reps at the last minute discounting the subscription value down so that they could get over that percentage threshold. So the company was going to bring in less business just so that reps weren't going to get hurt there. And I think the lesson there is that you should never be kind of putting a rep in a position where they should choose between what's good for the business and what's good for their earnings. It's just not a fair place to put them in. And you can judge all you want what they should be doing in that situation, but incentives should be aligned there. I think if you want to be pushing reps to do certain things, then the plan should make sense and should just be well aligned, or at least have the ability to, if you really need to do components like that, have some kind of like override functionality or review process, so that you don't kind of unwittingly drive bad behavior that, again, at the end of the day is just working against the company.
That's right. I mean, I think I would just add, we talked about keeping it simple and keeping sort of those goals. I think that's a common mistake also, is trying to solve for everything in your comp plan, right? You touched on a little bit, Alex, on the activity piece. It's, I think, overcomplicating the sales compensation plan. I'm getting a little tongue twisted too, but I think overcomplicating it is one of the biggest, I think, mistakes that a lot of companies make, right? Because when you overcomplicate it, then you're not driving any behavior, right? Mm-hmm. And if you make it too difficult to understand, then reps don't know what should they really be focused on? What is going to, what does the company want them to do so that they can do the right thing and also overachieve and earn their compensation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm curious.
Plans. Oh, go ahead, Christian.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say, I'm curious your thoughts on that, Rosalind. I think in a lot of cases, some folks will see will kind of take that advice to keep it simple, and kind of their next move from there would be to really strip down the plan and make it really, really basic and straightforward, and then just expect additional good behavior from the reps because they want them to, right? Would you say that there's kind of two elements there? There's simple to complex in the plans, but also then how transparent and well-defined and well-explained those plans are for the rep. Like, I think
Absolutely.
you can embrace some complexity and give your reps credit, especially for reps that are selling oftentimes some really complex software, but you do have to make it clear in black and white, the logic of the plan, how it works, how these mechanics are related to their behaviors. And at least, I don't know about you, but sometimes what I see is that that's not always clearly defined, and they revert to thinking that, well, the plan's too complex, we need to simplify it, when in reality, they just didn't maybe necessarily expose it to the reps, make sure that they all understood it.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that's the big part about designing and rolling out a plan. I think companies forget to educate and train, right? Make sure you communicate the plan. I mean, it's a great opportunity for motivation also, right? To kind of share the components of the plan, show that they were well thought out, be very clear on the objectives, show how reps are going to make money, and train and educate. And then also really important is doing that kind of the feedback loop, right? Doing the analysis in terms of, is the plan effective? Is it driving the behaviors you were expecting? You know, are you seeing the results that you're expecting? So yeah, definitely great points.
I have another good question from Robert Fisher around customer success variable comp plans. What do you tie them to? Is it tied to retention, contract upsell, something else? Looks like both of you may have some thoughts. I'll let Rosalind take this one first.
Yeah, sure. So I like to keep our customer success team sort of, as we call it, with the halo effect, right? Around, they're not sellers per se. They're there to literally help your customer be successful, right? Drive adoption, make sure they're seeing value, helping them understand how to use the product, and helping them, you know, just overall be more successful versus upselling. So I like to see sort of the account management team, or like a renewals team, or even your AEs, if that's what they're tasked with, is really doing the expansion and upsell piece. So for customer success, I think their, you know, their measurement should really be around net dollar retention, right? Retention, reducing churn, making sure that we're hitting KPIs with our customers.
I'd agree with that. I think it can vary just because companies, we at CaptivateIQ, we think of customer success in the same way Rosalind's describing at Clari. I think there's just that delineation there between a true CS motion and more account management, or kind of that farmer. But yeah, I think CS is more, makes sense to tie them to just net dollar retention. Sometimes we see them tied to CSAT scores or NPS as well. But usually that's one component of maybe two or three. A big one always being net dollar retention or renewal percentage, churn rate. Every kind of company looks at that differently in their KPIs, but whatever is kind of the key renewal or net churn metric for them.
Love it. Thank you. Here's a very good question from Denise Mostyn, very specific. During 2020, they shifted from kind of a one-off perpetual business model to a recurring revenue business model. What's best practice for paying commission on recurring revenue? Right now, they're paying a percentage of the deal plus a bonus for overachievement, but they're aware they're going to need to rethink the compensation plan structure for 2021. So again, what's kind of best practices for paying commission on recurring revenue?
I think that's, Rosalind, I think maybe we were talking about this the other day, that both of us have been in organizations that made that transition. And it's something that a lot of companies have gone through or are still going through. And I think comp plans can be the best way to drive that transition, because the whole adage being that compensation drives behavior, right? You can kind of create this pull to recurring revenue or to ARR through the compensation. There's kind of a couple different approaches here, where in some cases companies will keep the quota they already have that's on perpetual, but they will just use some kind of factor to multiply the ACV of a subscription deal to kind of normalize it against the perpetual value. I think that's just going to equalize things. If you really want to make a push towards it, then you need to make the subscription component more lucrative for the reps, which makes sense. Subscription, we know, is more lucrative for the business, is going to lead to higher valuation. So it's fine to be really kind of, in one sense, overpaying on those deals because you want to drive that transition as quickly as possible. I don't think you have to necessarily deprecate perpetual as a whole or penalize it, but should ensure that quotas are set appropriately, and maybe they're tied to a subscription, and then you're normalizing perpetual down in the event that perpetual deals are closed instead.
I would just kind of echo what Christian said. I mean, I think the sooner, depending on the speed at which you want to move your model, the comp structure is the best way to facilitate that change.
I think that comes back to, like, again, just aligning the comp plan with what the business wants. If you want to make them move, an organization that I had seen maybe 5 years ago now, they were all up in arms because they couldn't figure out why the reps kept selling perpetual deals. And it was because, I mean, very simply, the reps made more money on perpetual. So whether it was intentional or subconscious, their customers, their prospects were told all about why the perpetual deal was better for them versus the subscription option, if they even knew about it. And again, I think that's unfair of a company to ask a rep to side with what the company's saying they want versus what's better for them in the comp plan. I think that's more an issue in the design of the plan itself.
Love it. We got about 5 minutes left here. So if anyone in attendance has any last minute questions, throw them in the Q&A. We have a big bank of Q&A right now. We're not going to be able to get to it all. But if you ask a really good question, I'll forward you to the top. I think we'll go with this question next. What are your thoughts? We may have already covered this, but not in depth. What are your thoughts on creating a probationary period before paying commissions?
Do you want to start that one,
Sorry,
Rosalind?
Alaskan Internet. What are your thoughts?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on creating a probationary period before paying commissions?
Yeah, so I'm assuming this is more for kind of a new rep or somebody who's kind of new in the position.
So they have more details here. For example, you hire a rep at a competitive base and benefits. Before you pay commission, you set an expectation that they need to hit a certain level of performance that covers, in this case, their base and benefits. But when you hit that number, you pay them on a more aggressive tier of commission, right? So paying them at 20 to 25% versus 10 to 15%, for example.
That's an interesting structure because it sounds like more of a base without a variable component to their OTE. And I don't know if that was the intent, but I mean, I think from my perspective, like kind of going back to what Christian was saying, that anybody in a sales role should have a variable component and tied to some type of revenue number. So I think, I think about new hires coming on board. I've typically offered, depending on the type of role, there's an expectancy or expectation that there will be a ramp period. So whether that's a reduction in quota or it's some type of guarantee, like a non-recoverable or even a recoverable draw, that's sort of what I've seen in terms of best practice. And it's more about, if they need time to build their pipeline, right? Versus if you're maybe an account manager or type of farmer or renewal type of role where you may be given a book of business that you're maintaining. You probably need less of a ramp, but if you have just a wide open space and you're expected to, kind of break into this white space territory, I'll see more of a likelihood of some type of guarantee, at least for 3 months, possibly longer, depending on the type of business.
It's funny. I think the description there is kind of goes back to that cliff or minimum threshold we were talking about before. And I think from a company perspective, yeah, that rep might be ramping up on this probationary period, might not be closing deals, but you have to remember the opportunity cost of that rep joining your company is the deals that they're not closing at their last role. And I think in tech especially, it's still just a very competitive market. If you want to be hiring good folks, you have to be bringing them on with a competitive package beyond just the base and benefits. It's got to offset whatever they're walking away from at their current job, if that's a strong pipeline or potentially equity that you need to make sure that you're compensating with. Otherwise, you'll run the risk of only bringing on folks that don't necessarily have that opportunity cost because they weren't performing in a last role or something like that. And that's, again, not exactly what you want to be looking for.
It's a really good point. You know, when you're designing these comp plans, having to keep in mind matching at least the opportunity cost given your geo, given the current talent in the market. Yeah. Sarah, I think that actually answered your question. What's your point of view on cliffs and comp plans? So you just inadvertently answered, I think, 3 questions here. How do you incentivize annual versus multi-year contracts in B2B SaaS business? Sounds like we already covered this. You just maybe add a multiplier on top of, say, like your ACV. Does that sound, am I recapping that correctly, Christian? I think you just covered this.
Yeah, I think I'll say the typical, most common approach to this is you're only giving quota credit on ACV. So let's say just that first year value in a 3-year contract. And then you're paying some kind of flat rate on the additional years. Sometimes companies will pay some kind of uplift or give a quota credit bonus on the ACV. My humble opinion is that it's just cleaner to pay them a flat rate. And usually that's somewhere around half of the rep's base rate on additional years. And you can be flexible around allowing them to book 2-year contracts, 30-month contracts, 3-year, 5-year, whatever. If you want to just have a little more predictability around it, make sure you're not driving anyone to book some 5, 7, or 10-year deals. You can kind of limit it there, only give them options around a 1-year or a 3-year.
Here's a good question about all of us being remote now, specifically tying compensation to geographic areas. So if you're working a territory, let's say in San Francisco, New York, LA, very expensive areas, but you're working remote now, like we all are. Do you still take that into consideration? Is that tied to their comp plan still, or is remote now? Are you seeing remote now, impact these comp plans in ways it hasn't previously?
Yeah, so I think I shared kind of earlier on my philosophy is more, because especially for sales reps, even prior to this pandemic and folks working from home, if you have an outside sales team, they typically are going to sit all over the world, right? They're going to be, especially if you're global, they're going to sit everywhere. So I like to, keep their OT and their comp plan consistent across sort of within that country and within the role and expectations for the role. So I think if you design your plan that way, then you're less actually less influenced or impacted by, the most recent changes. But I think, when you look at market data, you're going to see obviously in certain areas where it is going to cost you more to acquire the right talent. And I think Christian probably has an opinion on this being in San Francisco.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to open the whole can of worms around what companies are considering if folks are moving. But I think to Rosalyn's point, it's always been common, especially for field sales reps, that there may be slight deviation based on like the experience of the role. But if you've got a field sales org all over the US, the woman sitting in South Carolina is making the same roughly OTE as somebody sitting in New York or San Francisco. Because they generally have the same quota, right? And you're expecting the same return. Why should the compensation be any different? I think there's arguments that come out when you start talking about different types of roles and that kind of thing. If you're hiring people in certain places versus someone moving somewhere else, but I'm generally in the camp that you pay for results, and you shouldn't finding other reasons to pay less for those same results just because somebody moved somewhere else or happens to be somewhere else doesn't necessarily make sense. Sure, it makes sense from a P&L perspective for the business. But again, I think then that's, especially with the way things are going, it's probably going to come back to making it more difficult for you to hire because you won't be offering a competitive package. There will always be another company, another kind of well-funded startup that wants to grab that person that will pay them a more competitive package if you won't.
Love that. Thank you. We're getting a lot of questions around like, can we see any visuals? Do you have any visuals to show us of comp plans, what that actually looks like, any contracts? And we do. So I'm going to throw it in chat right now at saleshacker.com. Winning by Design is a sales consulting company ran by this really eccentric, I think he's a Norwegian dude named Jocko. If you haven't seen any of his videos, I highly recommend you open up YouTube right now and type in Jocko Winning by Design. He's amazing. He wrote this article for us a while back. We actually covered It'd be a really fun exercise to watch the recording of this webinar with that article open on the side, because we covered a lot of the points that he covered as well, but he also included visual examples. So in the chat, if you want to see any visual examples of what we're talking about, open that up and then go YouTube Jocko, because you'll have a good time. And I want to leave us with this one question, kind of taking us back up at a high level. Steve Cole asked, would you recommend these same concepts for a current compensation overhaul? So it sounds like he's overhauling his entire compensation plan right now. Is there a specific place you would recommend to start when beginning the process? So if you were to help Steve out without knowing any of the details, I know it's difficult, but just generally, where should he start if he's doing a complete compensation overhaul? Can we give him like a quick recap of the things we covered today? I think I'll start with Rosalind.
Yeah, so I guess those kind of some of the practices that we talked about, I think will still apply. The fact that he's doing a complete overhaul tells me that there's issues or they've gone a different direction. Either there's problems with their comp plan not achieving the results they were expecting, or the company's kind of shifted their go-to-market and strategy. So I think still starting with your go-to-market, what are the objectives, kind of whiteboarding. It's almost like a blank sheet of paper, and start with, what am I trying to achieve? What are the top, 2-3 things that I really want to achieve, even 5 things, and then break it down from there. Keeping in mind, since it is an overhaul, of some of the things that didn't work well, to be able to avoid some of those pitfalls.
Love it.
I think starting with just simply kind of the sales org and the current plans aside, what does the business need? What's important to the business? I think if ARR is a big focus, then okay, TCV is not necessarily the key metric we want to be using in setting quotas. And there will typically be that one or two primary metrics. And then from there, you can talk about the other things that may be secondary but important, multi-year contracts, stuff like that. And then you can start to piece together what that plan looks like. I would really encourage anyone that's identified that they need to do a complete overhaul to really just set aside everything you've done historically and start from scratch. And you can use benchmarking data and industry best practices and that kind of stuff as checks against what you're building, but those really should just be checks or validation. If the the benchmark is that quota should be 4 to 6x OTE, okay, that makes sense. But let's really look at, is that feasible based on the pipeline production, or feasible based on what we expect a full cycle rep to be able to produce themselves in terms of pipeline. I think a lot of times comp plans just kind of get Frankensteined over years, and end up maybe getting to a place where you need to overhaul them. But I think that's an even better reason to just kind of start from scratch.
Great answers throughout the entire hour. Christian and Rosalind, you guys are like fountains of wisdom. Thank you so much for joining the community today. This was a lot of fun. And thank you, community, for joining us for the next, investing an hour of your time with us here today to learn all about sales compensation. Again, we'll send you a recording within about 24 hours. I'll probably include this link with Jocko. I may include some visual examples as well, just a little extra value adds. This was a lot of fun. Rosalind, Christian, thank you again.